Minister of Canada.
Canadian Armed Forces members to long-term care facilities in Quebec. Our men and women in uniform are doing an incredible job and saving lives. Since the end of April, the situation in a number of those facilities has stabilized. Support workers are now returning to work. That means that members of the Canadian Armed Forces that have been deployed to a facility where things have improved can now go and help out in other centers where the situation is more critical. This has allowed us to help more than 35 long-term care facilities thus far, and we continue to redeploy members of the CAF from centers that are under control to those that are in need. We are therefore extending the current mission of the Armed Forces in Quebec until June 26th. I want to be clear. The 1,400 members of the Armed Forces involved in Operation Laser are still in Quebec and are now being redeployed to facilities that need their help. We are continuing our discussions with Quebec with a view to developing a plan for the medium term that will allow us to support those efforts until September 15th. That plan includes the active participation of the Red Cross with people who are paid, properly trained, and who will be as efficient as members of the armed forces. The federal government will continue to be there for Quebecers.
Over the past few months, our government has been working with the provinces on providing care for seniors and the most vulnerable. This includes by deploying members of the Canadian Armed Forces to certain long-term care facilities. In Ontario and Quebec, we are extending this deployment to June 26th. Our women and men in uniform are doing a remarkable job. Their help is still needed, so we're making sure that our elders continue to have this vital support. To restart the economy, to get Canadians back on their feet, we need a coordinated, countrywide plan. And at the heart of this approach must be how we do this safely. In country after country, state after state, a pattern is emerging. People make sacrifices needed to flatten the curve, but then when governments decide to restart the economy, cases begin to rise again. And after months of hard work, people are finding themselves right back where they started. Canada must learn from these lessons. It's clear that we have to make safety and control of this virus a top priority in this restart. So that's exactly what we're doing. Our government is working with the provinces and territories to bring in the right measures to keep Canadians safe and healthy. Last week, I put forward our government's commitment, $14 billion towards a safe restart agreement for the things that Canadians will need in the 6 months ahead. At our First Minister's meeting yesterday, the Premiers, the Deputy Prime Minister and I continued our discussion on what this plan might look like. We talked about the measures needed, whether that's childcare and paid sick leave, contact tracing and testing, or PPE and support for the most vulnerable. And we talked about the fact that we must keep working together to support Canadians right across the country.
Last evening, the Premiers and myself also talked about media reports and videos that are circulating right now and that show violence against Black Canadians and Indigenous Canadians. During our discussion, I talked about the changes that must be made to our police forces, such as wearing video cameras. All orders of government must work together so that things can change as quickly as possible.
We've all now seen the shocking video of Chief Adams' arrest, and we must get to the bottom of this. Like many people, I have serious questions about what happened. The independent investigation must be transparent and be carried out so that we get answers. At the same time, though, we also know that this is not an isolated incident. Far too many Black Canadians and Indigenous people do not feel safe around police. It's unacceptable. And as governments, we have to change that. In my discussion with the Premiers yesterday evening, I brought this up. All leaders were united in condemning racism and in agreeing that we must do more to combat it. I raised with them some of the ways we can work together moving forward, including on practical things like the adoption of body cameras. This is something I've already discussed with RCMP Commissioner Lucky. But reforms are needed at all levels of policing, and these reforms need to happen quickly. In the days and weeks to come, our government will continue to move as fast as we can with all of our partners. Women and men who serve in our police forces must be part of the solution. They are people who've stepped up to serve their community, and they will be invaluable allies as we move forward to make sure that all Canadians are well served by these institutions. Today, I also want to speak about the progress we're making on travel and on our work to keep Canadians safe. Right now, physical distancing is still the best way to protect yourself and others. Of course, there are some places, like on flights, where it's not always possible to keep 2 meters apart. That's exactly why we've made it mandatory for travelers and staff to wear masks. We've also worked with airlines and airports on standards they should have in place, whether that's enhanced cleaning or putting distancing measures as people wait in line. And today, I can announce that we're taking another step forward. Our government is mandating temperature screening for air passengers through a phased approach. First for those traveling to Canada, then for those traveling from Canada, and finally for those traveling within Canada. A passenger who has a fever will not be permitted to board their flight. Employees in the secured areas of airports will also be required to have their temperature checked. There are strong measures already in place to keep people safe, and this screening will add yet another layer of protection.
Our government has noted new best practices that are currently in effect elsewhere in the world to protect people. That is why today I am announcing that we will be making temperature screening mandatory for air travelers as well as for staff and employees. I know that Minister Garneau will have more to say about that later today. In the coming weeks and the coming months, we will continue to explore other ways of protecting Canadians and limiting the spread of this virus.
Right across the country, in every city and town, Canadians are stepping up to help. If you want a great example, look no further than the Filipino-Canadian community. In Surrey, the community set up a blood donation drive as their way to pitch in. In Calgary, an organization called Fiesta Filipinos is raising money for care packages for families. In
Montreal, the Filipino community has set up a food program to deliver food to the elderly who live alone or who are in confinement. Today, on this day of Philippine independence, we're recognizing all the contributions made by the Filipino community in Canada. It's also an opportunity to denounce the obstacles placed in front of the members of that community.
As we celebrate Filipino Heritage Month, we can't ignore the ways in which our country must do better. Too many members of this community face discrimination, something that has gotten worse because of this pandemic. There is no place in this country for racism against Asian Canadians or anybody else. Now, more than ever, we need to stand up against discrimination and injustice in all its forms. As Canadians, we are always stronger together. Merci.
Thank you, Prime Minister. We'll now go to the phone for questions. One question, one follow-up. Operator.
Thank you. Merci. Première question, Raymond Fillon, TVA. À vous.
Thank you. Good morning, Prime Minister. With respect to the military in these seniors' homes, you're saying it's not a long-term solution, but why not to leave those soldiers in the homes until the middle of September, as Premier Legault has been asking? Well, we sent the Army into those long-term care homes because there was an emergency. There was no control of the pandemic within those long-term care homes. And in the last 2 months, we have seen marked improvements in terms of the way those facilities are operating. And we've also seen the return of support workers, and that is thanks to the work done by the Canadian Armed Forces members. Now, we know that even though it is not a short-term, a long-term solution, they were able to introduce measures and protocols and take steps that will continue for the medium to long term. With respect to Canadian staff, we are currently working with the Canadian Red Cross in order to have people who are well paid and properly trained that can take over from the CAF members, so that until September 15th, Canada will continue to be there to help in those homes. This is a reasonable approach that is focused on needs on the ground, and we are currently working on that plan with the government of Quebec. Follow up. Mr. Legault yesterday afternoon was saying we need 1,000 soldiers. You say, no, it's mission accomplished. Quebec doesn't need those soldiers anymore? No, on the contrary, the mission is not accomplished by any means. And as long as there are challenges there, the Government of Canada will be helping out in long-term care homes. But the 1,000 people that could help out were soldiers in the midst of a real emergency, but they can also be members of the Canadian Red Cross who are well paid and properly trained and who can take over from the CAF members without having that military background that really isn't necessary in terms of the services being provided in those homes. But as I said, we will continue to be there as a federal government to support Quebec and help it regain control of the situation in those facilities.
As I said from the beginning, we were going to be there, and we are there to help out our seniors in the long-term care facilities in Quebec. From the beginning, they were there to stabilize the situation, to set in place protocols and measures that were necessary while the situation was out of control. But over the past couple of months, the extraordinary work done by the members of the Canadian Armed Forces has made a huge difference. And many facilities have gone from condition red to condition green. We will continue, as a federal government, to ensure that our seniors in Quebec are protected. We are proposing and working with the province of Quebec to progressively replace those military members with trained people from the Canadian Red Cross who will be paid, who will be properly trained to be able to continue the important work being done while Quebec works to get its system back under control.
Merci. Operator, prochaine question.
Thank you. Merci. Prochaine question, Lina Dib, La Presse canadienne. À vous.
Oui, Monsieur Trudeau,
Good morning, Mr.
désolé
Trudeau.
d'insister sur le sujet,
Sorry
mais quand
that
même,
I'm
j'arrive
kind
pas
of
tout à fait
focusing on
à
this,
comprendre
but I
qu'est-ce
don't
qui
understand
empêche les
what
militaires
would
d'être dans
prevent
les
the military
CHSLD,
from
et parce que
remaining
si
in those
Monsieur Legault,
facilities.
c'est son évaluation de la situation,
If that's
c'est
Mr.
de ça
Legault's
qu'il a besoin
evaluation of the
maintenant,
need,
je ne
he
comprends
feels
pas,
he needs
comme
them
lui ne
now,
comprend pas,
and he
qu'est-ce
doesn't
qu'ils ont de mieux à
understand.
faire ailleurs
So, what better can they be doing elsewhere, those military personnel? Well, they're there to protect Quebecers and to protect all Canadians. They've done an incredible job in the last 2 months, and they continue to work in the long-term care facilities. And in fact, in a number of those facilities, they have greatly improved the situation, and now they can move to other homes or other facilities. But we also know that the military cannot represent a solution over the medium or long term, and that's why over the next little while we will be replacing them with members of the Canadian Red Cross that will be doing exactly the same thing as the military. They will be well trained and properly paid, and that will ensure that Quebecers can remain healthy and have the support they need until September 15th and beyond that, if there is a need. Follow up?
Oui, ça m'avance pas énormément.
Yes, well, that doesn't really answer my question.
Déjà tout à l'heure. Bref, la Croix-Rouge. alors,
Now,
qu'est-ce
the
qui
Red
empêche
Cross.
la Croix-Rouge
What
d'être
would
déjà
prevent
prête
the Red
d'avoir-
Cross
parce que
from
Monsieur Legault
already
dit
being ready to go
seulement
in?
400
Mr.
soldats qui
Legault
sont en train de servir dans les
is saying there are only 400 soldiers serving in those facilities right now. He wants 1,000. So what is delaying the deployment of Canadian Red Cross members to those facilities? Well, first of all, Lena, I want to point out that we did in fact send 1,400 soldiers into these facilities in Quebec under Operation Laser. Those soldiers are still deployed in Quebec under Operation Laser. But as I said, as certain facilities are regaining control of the situation, those military personnel can be sent elsewhere, and they are being redeployed to other homes. But of course, that requires the proper assessment of the situation, and that's why the numbers are somewhat fluctuating now. Now, with respect to the Canadian Red Cross, we are currently working with the Red Cross, but also with the Quebec government to develop the plan that will allow us to deploy them to those facilities in the coming weeks.
Merci. Prochaine question. Operator.
Thank you. Merci. Next question, Teresa Wright, the Canadian Press. Line open.
Yes, good morning, Prime Minister. I'd like to ask you about the video of the arrest of Chief Alan Adam. The RCMP said the treatment of Chief Adam was reasonable. Can you explain that to all the people who have now seen this video?
I think everyone who's seen this video has serious questions about what exactly happened, about how it happened this way, and about that use of force that we saw. That's why we're calling for an independent, transparent investigation that will get the answers that so many questions people are asking right now. Okay. I
think everyone who has seen that video has serious questions about what occurred, and that's why we are calling for an independent and transparent inquiry that will give us the answers we're seeking as to how this could have happened.
Follow up, Teresa.
Yes, thank you. On another topic, you've been promising to end the blood donation ban on men who have sex with men and trans women since 2015. Other countries have done this years ago. Why have you not yet kept this promise?
Our decisions from the very beginning have always been anchored in science and data. From the very start when we took office, we made significant changes to shorten the wait times, but they were still unacceptable. That's why we gave funding to Canadian Blood Services and Héma-Québec to do the studies necessary to be able to bring in new protocols, and we are very hopeful that we'll be able to announce the results and the change very soon. Okay.
From the very beginning, we recognized that we needed to change the current protocols to allow for everyone to make blood donations. And that's why we invested in Héma-Québec and Canadian Blood Services. We gave them millions of dollars so that they could do some research and do the necessary studies to base further decisions on science. And we do hope we can have some good things to announce very soon.
And we'll take one more call on the line.
Thank you. Merci. Next question, Ryan Timothy, National Post. Line open.
Yes, sir. I wanted to ask you a follow-up about the Chief Allen video. Given what you've seen, given the fact that the superior officers there decided initially that there was no problem, that the force wasn't excessive, do you think that's part of the systemic racism issue that you've seen in the RCMP? And are you concerned about what that says about how the RCMP senior officers view force?
I think we've seen examples of systemic discrimination, of systemic racism in the past days in many different ways. That's why we need to address it seriously. That's why we need both clear, independent, transparent investigations in the cases brought forward. But it's also why we need to look at the entire system to improve it, to make sure that situations like this don't happen in the future, and that our police officers who are there to protect and serve all Canadians are able to do that for all Canadians.
I believe the incidents that we have seen recently clearly point to the need for a transparent inquiry into those incidents, but also that we need to reform the system so that all Canadians are well served by their police forces.
Yeah, sir, just on another issue, after the bill failed to move forward Wednesday in Parliament, you said you'd continue working on it, that you wanted to get the payment out to people with disabilities. I'm wondering if parties opened up and made more negotiations, maybe changed some of your previous stances to help move that bill forward.
We are very hopeful we are going to be able to move forward to deliver for people with disabilities across this country. We know that they're facing extra costs because of this pandemic, and that's why we moved forward a bill, and we even offered to separate out that bill so just that measure could be moved forward on. Unfortunately, as we saw, other parties did not want to move forward even on that one thing. So we're now looking at ways of perhaps being able to deliver that without having to pass through legislation, but it will be more difficult and may take longer.
Bonjour, Monsieur Trudeau. Philippe Vincent Foisy de Radio-Canada.
Radio-Canada, first of all, on the Supreme Court decision with respect to the Francophone School Board in British Columbia, the Supreme Court will be forcing the government to supply money to the board for Francophone schools, but the province is saying it doesn't have enough money to fund those schools. Can the federal government help the province? Will it help the province in order to support language minorities in Canada and outside of Quebec so that they can receive quality education everywhere? Of course, as a government, we have taken many different measures to protect and strengthen protections, minority language communities right across the country. And this Supreme Court ruling is very good news for those communities and for our country as a whole. For a very long time now, those communities have been telling us that the provinces are not adequately funding the services that they deserve. And we hope that starting now, the provinces will better respect the needs of those communities. And as the federal government, we are always open to being there to help. But we also know that this is an area of jurisdiction of the provinces when it comes to education.
I think the Supreme Court decision is good news for minority language communities right across the country who've long felt that they haven't been receiving the right levels of services from their provincial governments. As a federal government, we've moved forward in many ways to strengthen protections and support minority language communities across this country. But we now hope that the provincial governments will step up further in areas that are their exclusive jurisdictions, like education and certain services for minority language communities. As a federal government, we will always stand ready to support and help minority language communities across this country.
Now, on the temperature screening for air travelers, do you think that people will have trouble trusting you on this? Because right from the beginning you said that doesn't work. You said masks didn't work. You said border closures didn't work, and then you went back on those ideas. So if it really does work, why didn't you introduce it earlier? Because you were saying earlier that it simply wouldn't work in a pandemic. So do you think people will believe you when you say that you need to put this measure in place now? Well, many weeks ago, we talked about the idea of temperature screening, and we were told at the time that this was not a particularly effective way of detecting COVID-19. But it is an additional element that can tell us whether someone is ill or too ill to travel or may have COVID-19. Now, certainly, we looked at those measures weeks ago, and we pretty much put an end to international travel at the time. So we really didn't need to do that. But now that we're starting to reopen the economy, we're starting to perhaps see more people coming into Canada in the coming weeks, we are looking to do what many other countries have been doing, which is to introduce additional measures. Now, this doesn't guarantee that we will be able to protect people. people. But it's another reasonable level of protection that will encourage people who are sick not to travel and to stay home. That's the first thing. But it could also be an additional level of protection to ensure that we're doing everything we can to protect Canadians.
We talked about the idea of thermal screenings for travelers a number of months ago. It was highlighted at that point and still remains the case that it is not a way of detecting COVID-19 in travelers. But it is an additional measure that can highlight symptoms of COVID-19, can highlight if someone is ill and shouldn't be traveling at all. It's not the panacea, it's not a 100% solution. It is an extra layer of safety to encourage people who might feel sick to stay home and not travel and put others at risks. And it also aligns with what many of our international partners are doing as well. It is something that is an additional measure that can make a difference, but it has to be included with a suite of measures that we're moving forward with to keep Canadians safe.
Brian Mullen, Global News. Just to follow up on one of the earlier questions, Prime Minister, when a young man took it upon himself to fight the blood ban at the Human Rights Commission, your government chose to fight him in federal court. Will you drop that case? And can you clarify that the changes you're planning to announce will mean an elimination of the 3-month deferral?
The policy on MSM blood donations has long been discriminatory. But we know, and Canada has learned through strong, unfortunate experience, that the safety of our blood supply is something that we have to anchor in science. And that's why when we got elected in 2015 with a commitment to end the blood donation ban, we heard that the science was not there to be able to do it. We said, okay, well, here's millions of dollars for the Canadian Blood Services and Héma-Québec to do the research necessary to be able to eliminate that ban safely so that we can still have a safe blood supply and we can move forward on ending discrimination against the LGBT community. We have made significant steps forward. We will continue to anchor our decisions in science and protections of Canadians. But as I've said, we will work to end this discrimination. Okay.
As I said, this is a process that discriminates against the LGBTQ community, and we will be working with Héma-Québec and Canadian Blood Services to ensure that we can base ourselves only on science and the safety of Canadians as we move forward to remove these discriminatory practices. And we will have more to say about that very soon.
Good morning, Prime Minister. Ashley Burke, CBC News. You just said that your decisions are anchored in science. That's something that you've been saying repeatedly throughout this pandemic. But science has shown that temperature checks did not stop the spread of SARS. Dr. Tam, Canada's top doctor, has also said that it's not an effective tool for detecting people with COVID-19. So if you believe in making your decisions based on science, why are you backing this when the science isn't there?
Science has certainly shown that people with fevers should not travel on international airlines at a time of pandemic. This is not, temperature checks will not be detecting cases of COVID-19. Science is very clear that it is not a surefire way of screening out people with COVID from people who don't have COVID. It is an extra layer of protection on top of many others that can have positive effects on people who decide that since they stay sick, they will stay home and not travel rather than be turned around at the airport. It's an extra layer of protection for people coming into Canada, but it is not the one surefire way of keeping Canadians safe. I absolutely agree, obviously, with the science on that. But it is a measure that we can move forward with that, in addition to other measures, can be effective at making sure that Canadians are kept safer. We know
full well that temperature screening will not tell us who has COVID-19 and who doesn't have COVID-19. There's no doubt that in that regard, this is not a measure that is particularly useful for that purpose, but it is an additional level of protection to encourage people who are ill not to travel and to detect individuals who may have symptoms of COVID-19. It's just an additional measure that will protect people. And I think Canadians expect us to do whatever we can to keep them safe, and that's what we're doing.
Now that Canadians have seen the video of Chief Adams being tackled without warning, do you believe that those officers should still be members of the RCMP? And what does it say to you that the RCMP commissioner's seen that video and doesn't understand the definition of systemic racism?
I think it's extremely important that we have an open, transparent, independent investigation into that incident and many other incidents like that. There is important answers to have on these specific things, but also on the pattern that we are seeing of why so many Indigenous Canadians or racialized Canadians are afraid when they are interacting with the police. These are things that we need to address, and we're working on it together. Okay.
I think that these incidents clearly point to the need for direct, open and transparent inquiries with respect to these incidents, but it also tells us that there is a problem of systemic discrimination within our systems and our institutions, because Indigenous people and racialized Canadians do not feel safe when they have an interaction with the police.
Kevin Gallagher, CTV National News, Prime Minister. So you've talked today about the need for reform within the RCMP. You've said you're disturbed by the arrest dashcam video of Chief Adam, while the Wood Buffalo RCMP found the actions of the officers reasonable and not really worthy of further investigation. We've also heard comments from top brass within the RCMP questioning whether there's systemic racism in the force. Do you still have confidence in the top leadership of Canada's National Police Force to make the necessary reforms that you say are needed?
The events that have been brought to light over the past days highlight that, without question, there is systemic discrimination within our institutions, including within the RCMP. We need to move forward to correct that, and I continue to have confidence in Commissioner Lucky for the changes that she's made already within the force and the more changes we need to make quickly to ensure that the women and men who serve in our police forces across the country, including the RCMP, can better serve their fellow Canadians, particularly Indigenous and racialized Canadians.
I continue to have confidence in Commissioner Lucky because of the things she's done and the steps that she will be taking. But there is no doubt that there is a problem of systemic discrimination within our institutions and our police forces, including the RCMP. And we have to address that problem, and that's precisely what we will do.
Following up on that question, given that Commissioner Lucky still has to learn what systemic racism is she not an impediment to the swift reforms that you say are needed?
I think there are an awful lot of people who are learning just this week what systemic racism actually is and what it means for racialized Canadians, for Indigenous Canadians. There are some deep changes we need to make in our institutions, and we need to work with people who want to make those changes, who want to be part of the solution, and I know Commissioner Lucky is one of those.
One of the reasons why Canadians can dismiss the existence of systemic racism and dismiss these incidents as anecdotes and one-offs is because your government has not mandated the collection and release of disaggregated police use of force data. Will you do that, and when?
We have made significant steps over the past years on the collection of disaggregated data. We need race-based data to be able to understand exactly what's going on, whether it's in our communities, whether it's with policing, whether it's in financial sectors. Understanding the vulnerability that certain Canadians face in a systemic way is extremely important, which is why we have moved forward on disaggregated disaggregated data, but why we will need to continue to do much more to better understand how our systems are unfair towards certain Canadians, particularly Black Canadians, Indigenous Canadians, and racialized Canadians. Merci beaucoup.